Hi, everybody. I'm Samantha Steiner, and this is week 3 of multilingual nonfiction writing. I have my handy dandy mini whiteboard here with the Sarah Lawrence logo on it. So it's good to see everybody, or rather to feel your technological presence, whether that is in the present or in the future, as I will be in your past. If anyone has taken a closer peek at Ruth Ozeki, which I mentioned from last week, you'll recognize that from the very beginning of her novel, A Tale from the Time Being. Anyway, this week we're going to talk about unfamiliar languages. And as I mentioned in the last class, the idea of familiar and unfamiliar language, those are just terms that I created to make discussion a little bit easier. So these are purely my terms. But by unfamiliar language, I mean that a language that I, as writer, feel that I don't know very well, or that the gaps in my understanding are such that I don't feel confident trying to speak for the speakers of that language or trying to represent that language, or I actually feel that I could assume the average person would know more about it than I would. So this is a point of ignorance, right? Which is, I think, our first knee-jerk reaction to writing from a place of ignorance is to try to reach for what we do know, to find some kind of foothold. But I think it's actually much more interesting and exciting to jump into the ignorance, to sort of right into the problem. I'm a big believer in that. So I think writing is a very humbling task, and this is maybe one of the most humbling aspects of it, just accepting but not despairing over the fact that we will never be able to call ourselves experts, but that we might not even be able to call ourselves knowledgeable on a topic. So with that said, let's take a peek at an excerpt, just a page from the comic Fun Home, which was made into a Broadway musical, but is also a graphic novel, which I have here. It's delightful. It's a very quick read. Because it's a mix of text and image, this is a work that operates in 2 different languages, right? 2 languages that we probably all or most of us learned without much conscious effort, which I think is really wonderful. Anyway, I'm going to do a screen share and show just one slide here. So this is actually, to give a little context, this is right when Bechdel is told by her peers that she's a butch. She's called that word, and she says that she doesn't know what it means. But this is what she does know. It was self-descriptive, cropped, curt, percussive, practically onomatopoeic, at any rate, the opposite of sissy. And here we have 2 people playing basketball, and a radio playing Hey There, Georgie Girl, which adds an extra layer of meaning. This is a song about a woman learning to become more traditionally feminine. Anyway, and despite the tyrannical power with which he held sway, this is her father she's speaking of. And I should add, this is a work of memoir. This is nonfiction. It was clear to me that my father was a big sissy. What did you do with your barrette? Proust refers to his explicitly homosexual characters as inverts. I've always been fond of this antiquated clinical term. It fell out. I don't care. Next time I see you without it, I'll whale you. Ow. So what's happening here? For one thing, we've got 3 words that are really highly charged. The first is butch. The second is sissy, and the third is invert. And so I believe Alison Bechdel has structured this panel so beautifully, because we see that that she identifies with butch as a great compliment, or as something identity affirming and empowering. And so the way she describes the word, even without understanding its dictionary definition, as cropped, curt, percussive, practically onomatopoeic. This feels like a poem of praise that she's reciting for the word butch and why it fits so well for her. And then sissy, this is so clearly an insult, right? And so for her father, she's saying, despite the tyrannical power with which he held sway, it was clear to me. So big sissy is a way of weakening him, right? It's held in contrast to his tyrannical power. And then finally, invert, which is, she calls an antiquated clinical term, but she also says she's fond of it. So first there's her attitude towards butch, which is positive and empowering. And then sissy, which is dehumanizing, right? Weakening, disempowering, highly negative. And then invert, which feels as close to neutral as we get here. It's extremely detached. And so without ever really defining these terms, the closest she gets to actually defining is with invert, where she just says that means homosexual characters. But beyond that, she's explaining how these three different words, all from the English language, mean three very different things. So that's one first peek at Bechdel's work. And now I want to show one other strip that I find really exciting. So this next strip I'm going to show, actually Bechdel wrote or created after her her book was turned into a musical. And so I'm going to screen share again and hope that this text in this piece is large enough for everyone to see. I hope that everyone can go to full screen for their view. Okay, here we go. So Fun Home, the musical by Alison Bechdel. I missed the opening night of Fun Home, the off-Broadway musical adapted from a graphic memoir I had published 7 years earlier. Due to a scheduling conflict, I found myself in a hotel in rural Ohio, repeatedly refreshing the New York Times theater page. Click. I was just as glad to be in Ohio that night. It was familiar. Growing up in Pennsylvania, New York City had always been a distant beacon. Click, click. I had ceded any creative control over the play. When I saw a preview 2 weeks earlier, I'd been stunned by how good it was. Where's your barrette? And now we can recognize where that line came from. But then, how could I have any critical objectivity whatsoever on a musical based on my own real life and family? Put it back in. It keeps the hair out of your eyes. Small Allison, Bruce. My memoir had been an intricate, non-linear account of my closeted gay father's suicide and my own coming out as a lesbian. So would a crew cut. Allison. I couldn't imagine anyone breaking into song, but then I learned that musicals are always about life and death situations. You didn't notice her at first, but I saw her. She was an old school butch. And there again, we have that very empowering word. And here we were singing. One of my earliest childhood memories had become a lesbian anthem. Someone just walked in the door like no one I ever saw before. My excruciatingly awkward first sexual experience was turned into an exuberant showstopper. I'm changing my major to Joan. Medium Allison. And so I'd like to point out, just while we're halfway through, the way in which this piece is actually translating a musical into a comic, and not just a comic, a graphic memoir, right? Not a full-length book, of course, but that somehow Bechdel's taking her experience to a comic, to a musical, to a comic, and this has been through all kinds of transformations. My mother, who had been a vague character in my book, was fleshed out with a devastating song about the toll of sacrifice. Days and days and days, that's how it happens, Helen. And the moment my father steps in front of the truck is a raw, dissonant revelation. I can't go back. I can't find my way through. And notice Bechdel as a person in the audience watching her own play, or watching the play based upon the work she's written. My real mother had been ambivalent about my book and was even more so about the musical. Well, I'll be interested to see the reviews. Keep in mind, or just to inform anyone who wasn't aware, Bechdel's mother was an actress, so she has a certain knowledge of Broadway, and so maybe her disinterest is a little surprising. She was passionate about the theater. I learned from her that the Times Review meant life or death for a play. The show spent years in development. Mom died 5 months before it opened. I was never really invested in her seeing it. Click. And we're back to that frame from the beginning, right? Second panel. I knew it would have been too painful for her in many different ways, but how I wish she could have seen the review. Jesus, it's up. It was startling. It was a startling, unqualified rave. My parents, who had met as it happened in a play, would get to go on living in one. So, where is the question of translation or the idea of an unfamiliar language here? For me, I think it's actually the narrator's relationship with musicals. That she and the her relationship with musical reviews. So this idea that she asks her mother in the second to last column or panel, my real mother had been ambivalent about my book and was even more so about the musical. I'll be interested to see the reviews. So she's telling us that the reviews are important, right? It's not Bechdel who's telling us to take a look at the reviews. And then in the next panel, she was passionate about the theater. I learned from her that the Times Review meant life or death for a play. So I think it's really fun what Bechdel is doing. She doesn't have to explain that the Times Review means life or death for a play. She can take it out of her mother's mouth or another character's mouth, and provide this to us as evidence that she doesn't really have to explain. And in the same process, right, doing this work, there's got to be some reason or some payoff. This is actually posing a question and creating suspense. The Times Review means life or death for the play. And so the question is, will it live or will it die? And the ending panel is so touching because not only does the play live, but her parents, and specifically her mother, who dies 5 months before the play comes out, both of them go on living on in the form of the play. So I think that's just beautiful. And I think I never question Bechdel's knowledge about musicals or about musical reviews because she's so frank with us from the beginning, that she says, I couldn't imagine anyone breaking into song. And so her wonder and mystery is so earnestly delivered. I trust her all the way through. So I think this is an example that we can all turn to in our writing of sort of explaining the problem or writing into the problem and then turning to an authority within our writing, right? Who does know more about this and what do they have to say? And so in this case, the mother, who only physically appears in one panel, right? Not including the actress who plays the mother, just the mother herself. She has so much sway. She's the authority in this piece. Anyway, that is Alison Bechdel. And while her writing seems mostly monolingual, I think it doesn't take too much work to translate the lessons in it to the multilingual sphere. I wanted to talk very briefly about an idea I actually learned from Aaron Sorkin's masterclass, which I recommend highly. He talks about having one character in the room whose knowledge is sort of at zero, so that everything can be explained to that character and the author, or rather the audience, can learn empathetically along with that character. But in the case of writing in a language that is unfamiliar to me as a writer, but may be familiar to all my readers, then the question arises of what's the point of that naivety? And actually, what can we learn from that naivety? And so I think actually it's a lesson in empathy. It's actually asking the audience, it's asking the audience to empathize with a point of ignorance or of not knowing. And I think this is so fun because I've heard actually, this is not from Aaron Sorkin, this is just a general life experience, that writing can really do two things, which is to defamiliarize what feels familiar or to make it feel alien to us, or else to make familiar to us situations we would never experience in our everyday lives. And so I think this really falls into the first category. So maybe in response to Aaron Sorkin, I would say having that naive character is really useful to help the audience remember what it's like not to know, even if they do know. With that said, um, let's look at another passage. This is by the author Paisley Rekdal, from her book. Here we go. This is from her book. I'll scroll up. Oh, The Night My Mother Met Bruce Lee. And if that is not enough to draw you in, then I don't know. This is observations on not fitting in. So here, this is really a linguistic deep dive. We do not live here. We are only visitors. In Taipei, one of the first things I notice are the white cotton masks strapped to the faces of the women. Men wear them too, but the number of women wearing these makeshift face filters exceed the number of men and give Taipei the look of being run by a skinny, anonymous band of surgeons. I imagine with today's global situation, this feels especially familiar to us, but this was actually written well before. After 2 days, my mother, who notices this as well, wants to buy a mask for herself. I argue against it more vehemently than the situation requires, saying that we will only be in Taipei 12 days. Whatever damage meant to be done to our lungs in that time will not magically be eliminated by a piece of cotton with 2 rubber bands. So we can see how disparaging this narrator is that she calls the mask a piece of cotton with 2 rubber bands. But my mother insists. Near the markets where they sell the masks, she spends minutes haggling with the merchant for a better price than she believes she is being offered. I lounge and snort, tug her away when the merchant's gesticulations become too frenzied to be understood. I should add, Paisley Rekdal is biracial. Her father is Caucasian, her mother is Asian. In restaurants, we argue half-heartedly about the necessity of masks until we reach a compromise. Now she walks around clutching an old scarf to her face and breathing shallowly. Soon we notice older Chinese women doing the same. Only the young women seem to have adopted the earband model. With my mother's wiry skunk hair and still unlined almond eyes peeking over the tips of her scarf, she has the perfect outfit for traveling. Her brown scarf allows her to blend in with the crowds of older Chinese women in the markets and on the street, while always covering her mouth, muffling the fact that she can't speak Chinese. What a mic drop moment, right? To just reveal the other. At night in Taipei, after my mother dozes off in front of the hotel television, I think about Mark in Seattle, how we argue in bed together about whether we should marry. Mark had almost proposed twice, but thought better of it, he said, when he recalled how easily I became seasick. Mark is an Englishman from Kent who works as a navigator for certain shipping companies. We met in Ireland, where I lived for a year. He followed me home when I returned to Seattle. Mark had half the year off from work and decided, in his typically spontaneous fashion, to buy a plane ticket to the States the morning he drove me to the airport. Within 2 weeks of my return, he was sharing my room in the house I rented with friends. Mark has hired himself out as a sailing instructor now and spends the better part of every weekend teaching his latest student the rudiments of tacking. I can't spend more than a few minutes on a boat without being overcome by nausea. Besides the fact of my seasickness, however, I have found other, more pressing reasons to be hesitant about marriage, such as our inability to agree on anything. And I find this sentence so quietly hilarious. Our inability to agree on anything. That's a pretty good reason. Still, marriage seems like the next logical step we need to take on in our relationship. And for a while, we have pursued the subject relentlessly. But whatever reasons we could invent for ourselves to believe marriage is the right answer, neither of us makes a move to propose. We have stopped referring to marriage at all. My nausea has become a symbol of our stasis. I'm going sailing, Mark will say, looking meaningfully at me. Do you want to come? And I, bilious at the sight of a dock, shake my head. I see this as another form of admission of ignorance, or at least a feeling that she's a visitor, right? We do not live here. We are only visitors. This idea that she can't even look at a dock, that she won't go out to sea with him, literally, or in the sense of marriage. And also she mentions she teaches his latest student the rudiments of tacking. I don't feel like she's giving us the impression she knows what tacking is, just that she's reciting a phrase she's heard a million times before. Oh, I'm going to teach him tacking, right? And so, like, how much she actually knows about tacking feels irrelevant here. And I think it's actually more dramatic if she knows less. So that's a way of working ignorance to one's advantage. To continue. In the past weeks, we have argued so much that we have stopped conversing almost altogether, replacing normal dialogue with sexual banter, teasing each other about our accents. Zebra, I say. Zebra, Mark answers. Tonight in Taipei, in front of the flickering television, I think about his pink hands. Okay, so we've got linguistic differences in pronunciation. And then we have this really quick jump. Tonight in Taipei. That's all we need for a tip off of we're traveling from past and the US to present to Taipei. So tonight in Taipei, in front of the flickering television, I think about his pink hands, the way his face always appears chapped in the sunset. I won't admit it to him, but I love his accent. The first time my maternal grandmother, Popo, met him was at her birthday celebration at my parents' house in Seattle. I can't understand a thing he says, she announced loudly after he'd greeted her. Again, like moments of humor sprinkled in among some really fraught content about being together with a person and not being able to decide whether or not to marry. In bed, sometimes he asks me to recite the few Chinese phrases I know. Kai Nui, I say, stroking his chin. Gong Hei Fa Choi, Xie Xie, Su Jiep. But his favorite is the insult, the epithet Popo called my father before my parents married. Lo Fan, I murmur, kissing him. Old savage, Lo Fan. I feel the detail I want to point to here, which is so cleverly tucked in, the epithet my Popo called my father before my parents married. So the knowledge that Paisley Rechdal's father is white and Paisley Rechdal's boyfriend, or perhaps fiance, but certainly her love interest, is also white. And this idea of resentment, old savage, of an insult hurled in a language that the other person cannot understand. This whole piece lives in the place of non-understanding. And so it becomes not just about Paisley Rechdal's failure to understand Mark and Mark's love of seafaring and Mark's failure to understand Chinese. It's also about generational differences, right? In this case, Paisley Rechdal's grandmother represents all her ancestry, right? Without her explicitly saying that, without her making any big claims, but we can feel that there's this echo around the grandmother's words, that I can't understand a thing he says. That feels really powerful. So I find that passage, again, just beautiful writing and beautiful mystery, and very brave in the way that it doesn't try to write around the mistranslations and the confusions. And if anyone has time to read to the end of that story, it delves even further into the idea of a mother and a daughter wandering through Taipei, and their physical appearances being different enough that people assume that the mother speaks Chinese, but they assume that the daughter does not understand, and the surprise people experience at finding that neither of them understands. And so I'd like to move on to one last piece of reading here. This is Richard Rodriguez. This is an excerpt from his book. So again, I am just figuring out how to do screen share here. That's back to Paisley Rectal. Okay. Let's go for plain old desktop. There we go. Okay, thank you for your patience, everybody. So, again, this is from Aria, a memoir of a bilingual childhood. And I feel this piece hits the nail on the head, to be a little lazy in my speech and use a cliche. Aria, a memoir of a bilingual childhood, is taken from Hunger of Memory. First published in the American Scholar in 1981, this poignant memoir sets forth the author's views of bilingual education. To the child Rodriguez, Spanish was a private language, English a public one. And so I'm going to move on just because the part of the essay that feels pertinent comes a few paragraphs in. So, during those years when I was first learning to speak, my mother and father addressed me only in Spanish. In Spanish, I learned to reply. By contrast, English, inglés, notice the first intrusion of another language, was the language I came to associate with gringos, rarely heard in the house. I learned my first words of English overhearing my parents speaking to strangers. At 6 years of age, I knew just enough words for my mother to trust me on errands to stores 1 block away, but no more. So what I love here is we're establishing exactly how comfortable he feels with Spanish, which really seems to be his home language, and how comfortable he feels with English, just enough to go to the stores 1 block away, but no more. So we have a sense that his English is very shaky initially. I was then a listening child, careful to hear the very different sounds of Spanish and English. Wide-eyed with hearing, I'd listen to the sounds more than to the words. First, there were English, gringo sounds. So many words still were unknown to me that when the butcher or the lady at the drugstore said something, exotic polysyllabic sounds would bloom in the midst of their sentences. Let's take one peek at that sentence. He uses the word exotic, which is so often used by English speakers to describe cultures outside of what they consider, and we have to put air quotes around this, normal, right? Because what is normal, that's always a relative term. And it's usually defined by people in positions of power and instrumented as a weapon against people who are not in positions of power. So I really love this reversal. Often, the speech of people in public seemed to me very loud, booming with confidence. The man behind the counter would literally ask, "What can I do for you?" But by being so firm and clear, the sound of his voice said that he was a gringo, He belonged in public society. There were also the high nasal notes of middle-class American speech, which I rarely am conscious of hearing today because I hear them so often, but could not stop hearing when I was a boy. Crowds at Safeway or at bus stops were noisy with the bird-like sounds of Los Gringos. I'd move away from them all the chirping chatter above me. So, with only the phrase, "What can I do for you?" Rodriguez has conveyed exactly what this language means to him. That it inspires confidence, that it's used by people who feel proud to be in public. And so I don't really need to hear more English than that, right? And he doesn't need to understand more English than, "What can I do for you?" We understand exactly what the language means to him, even from a position of ignorance. Um, and this is a really fun kind of juggling because we know that Rodriguez is writing in English now, that he's uh, learned a lot more than what he knew at the time. But he's recreating the experience he had when he was first learning English. My own sounds I was unable to hear, but I knew that I spoke English poorly. My words could not extend to form complete thoughts, and the words I did speak I didn't know well enough to make distinct sounds. Listeners would usually lower their heads to hear better what I was trying to say. And here we see the use of body language, right? Um, in order to supplement or augment for what was not happening linguistically. But it was one thing for me to speak English with difficulty. It was more troubling to hear my parents speaking in public. Their high whining vowels and guttural consonants, their sentences that got stuck with and ah sounds, the confused syntax, the hesitant rhythm of sounds so different from the way gringos spoke. I'd noticed, moreover, that my parents' voices were softer than those of gringos we would meet. I feel this paragraph does such a beautiful job of showing um, the parents' failure to speak English as defined by the parents, right? That their shame of their soft voices and the way that their heads are positioned, right? So that instead of Rodriguez appearing judgmental or evaluative, he's actually talking about how he's feeling and how he perceives his parents are feeling, which is so much more rich than grading them and saying, they could pronounce this, but they had trouble pronouncing that. Here, I feel for this whole family. I am tempted to say now that none of this mattered. In adulthood, I am embarrassed by childhood fears. And in a way, it didn't matter very much that my parents could not speak English with ease. Their linguistic difficulties had no serious consequences. My mother and father made themselves understood at the county hospital clinic and at government offices. And yet, in another way, it mattered very much. It was unsettling to hear my parents struggle with English. Hearing them, I'd grow nervous, and my clutching trust in their protection and power would be weakened. There's much more to this passage, but I think we'll leave it at that for now. So I'd like to use this last passage just as a springboard for our writing prompt for this week. In no more than 400 words, right? Oh, I'm sorry. I'm going to actually share screen so that everyone can see this. Why not make it easier? Okay. So here we have, in no more than 400 words, write a true story about a time when you misinterpreted or failed to understand some aspect of another language or culture. Incorporate the language of that culture to tell that story. So Rodriguez did this in a really quiet and beautiful way, talking about his failure and even greater, his parents' failure to understand English. And he does this in a way that's so non-judgmental, I feel. He's owning the way he judged them when he was younger, but the narrative perspective seems much more empathetic. And then I feel that as writers, especially writers who are coming from some position of privilege, I feel that the really risky and really brave move is actually to write about a failure to understand a language or culture that has historically been marginalized or deprived of power, and realizing um, the ways in which we've all misbehaved or misinterpreted. Um, for examples of this, one might want to look at Tara Westover's memoir, Educated. She does a wonderful job of owning her ignorances or her past ignorances. Um, but writing from a position of privilege is always very difficult to do ethically and to do well. Um, but it's also really necessary. So, for anyone who feels excited and willing um, to own past errors and to admit present ignorances, um, I really would encourage this. One pitfall in completing this assignment could be to claim one has completely rehabilitated or one completely understands the mistake that they made and they will never make it again, nor will they ever make any mistake, and to make any kind of claims of I'm no longer a racist or a sexist or a homophobe. Those absolutes tend to garner at least my suspicion. So I encourage all of us to really point to where we are exactly. If we are at a point where we can go one block away to the grocery store, but no further, right, in our understanding of any culture or any aspect of another human's experience, then I would encourage us all to own that. And so, with that, I hope everyone has enjoyed week 3 of languages, um, unfamiliar languages. And I really look forward to hearing and seeing what everyone's written. So feel free to email me. I've listed my email in the past couple of videos at the end of each video. But just as a reminder, it's Samantha_Steiner at alumni.brown.edu. And happy writing, everybody.